miles of landfall. So it's going to be a very small section of Volusia County, but again, it's imputed to the entire county by virtue of the fact that part of the unincorporated county is within 100 miles. Really poorly drafted bill.
All right.
It's really,
Thank you. Right now, we're observing, like, the city of New Smyrna Beach is entertaining some changes to their zoning regulations that are making some restrictions on uses. But they're more than 100 miles away from the point of contact on Hutchinson Island.
okay, so Wendy, sorry, and then Jessica, or do I have it backwards?
One of the things that I know we've been kind of keeping in the back of our minds is that the water management districts have been going through a pretty robust rulemaking process for the last year or two. And, you know, particularly as it pertains to LID. And so I'm curious how this legislation impacts the process that they're undergoing. And if they come out with clear rules that then require us to change our ordinances that are more restrictive or burdensome. I just wonder how that's going to shake out. And so that's kind of a question maybe for Chris or for others, but let me get my second thought out. Last time, or maybe, I don't remember if it was our June meeting or our May meeting, Alex brought up what I thought is one of the most important points we've made all along, which is the importance of the community rating system as a way of establishing homeowners insurance rates and keeping housing affordable. And so LID is a tool in the toolbox that gives communities in the county an improved CRS that that could benefit all of us. And so I'm just trying to wrap my head around how all of these big challenges that the state is facing, how this makes any sense. Those are my two thoughts.
I think those are things for the court of public opinion, most certainly, if not actually a legal court. But for our work, we just have to do what we collectively think is the right thing and get that memorialized, to my mind anyway. And Jessica, you had something.
Yeah, agree with a lot of the statements made. I just want to say that if we are looking at certain items that we think are very important, especially in the low impact development context, I believe that 250 carves out PDs, basically, where a change is requested by the property owner and it only applies to their property. And so if there's something where we say for low impact development in a planned development, we think we want this to apply, those could still move forward, is my understanding. It's kind of a temporary.
It does say that. Okay, so our consensus at this point is that we go forward with our work and that we work on the LID as a voluntary compliance, but with all of the reasons why that we come to. Did I get that right? Have we captured that? At least we go forward with using the audit, going to the county council for direction to use the audit tool to redo the language, and then that will either be 100% voluntary or not.
It also includes a de facto retroactive date back to September 28th of 2022.
Correct.
Have we had any LDC changes since September 28th?
Yeah.
Had changes, but they've not been necessarily restrictive.
How about changes to review procedure or permitting approval procedures?
No.
Figured I'd ask the question.
Yeah.
No worries. Trust me, we started looking backwards as well.
Jessica.
My follow-up question is, I know on the landfall that I believe you that there's only certain portions or local governments in Volusia County. Isn't there another catch-all on FEMA designated areas where it has the same rule repeated? And are the local governments like New Smyrna within a FEMA disaster declared area where it would still apply?
Line 424. Effective January 1st, 2023, local governments located in areas designated in the Federal Emergency Management Agency disaster declarations for Hurricane Ian or Hurricane Nicole may not raise building inspection fees, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on.
Then it goes back to repeat the restrictive comp plan measures. So I think it does apply to everybody.
I don't see a in addition, a replication of the comp plan section, just the building.
Just the fees.
It is 553.8, section 14. County or municipality located in an area designated in FEMA disaster declaration for Hurricane Ian and Nicole may not adopt more restrictive procedures for proposing amendments to its comp plan or land development regulations or for issuing development permit or development order as those terms are defined until October 1st, 2024.
Yeah, mine doesn't say that.
I'm looking at the enrolled building.
Or you need glasses.
Yeah, I'm looking at the same one. I don't see that either.
Engrossed or enrolled?
Engrossed.
It says engrossed, yeah. There's original file committee substance.
Yeah,
Right.
second engrossed. That's what I'm looking at too.
Enrolled. Enrolled should be the law.
Okay.
It does say, so the second engrossed also says enrolled at the top.
Yeah, it does. It says enrolled 2023 legislature CS for SB 250 second engrossed.
I can look into that and report back. That wasn't the purview of what I was looking into for today.
We'll call up New Smyrna Beach and tell them to stop.
It's just a question, just relevant, you know.
So the PDF shows it, the web page version doesn't.
Well, I'm on the PDF and it doesn't show it. So maybe I downloaded a PDF at a different day. Anyway, I'll report back to the group.
Oh, that
Yeah.
pesky.
It says the same, I don't see it saying it under section 14. Section 14 says the county. Entire or virtually with them.
Bill.
But that can then be a positive thing for us so that you can design the rule changes so that they're not more onerous, but that they're voluntary. And then the audit tool will go back and look at different parts of the code to make sure that it's incentivized instead of mandated. So that could be,
All right. Now that we have resolved what we're going to do about LID and that we're not going to disband, we're going to move forward. Shall we go on to wetlands? Put your boots on.
Yes, but I actually neglected to do one thing before we started, and I'll just introduce a couple of new faces on our team. So this is Samantha West. She has taken Katrina's position as Sustainability and Resilience Manager. And she's not new to the county, but she's just new to this position. So if you want to say hey.
It's a good one.
I've been at the county for 7 years, worked my way through land development, then over to planning, environmental permitting, and then was land development manager for almost 2 years. And now I'm over here back at environmental.
Where she belongs.
Quick synopsis.
Maybe.
Hands off, Clay, hands off. And then we have another new face over here. This is Chelsea Moulton. Chelsea has taken over our staff position. And so this is, of course, her first meeting with us, but she's going to be wonderful. So she'll be helping me and taking over some of the tasks that Brianna has been doing so graciously for us. So you'll probably get emails from time to time from Chelsea. So just keep an eye out for that.
Welcome to both. Good to
And
see
then
you.
there's another person in the room who's not new, but you probably haven't seen him before. We have Todd Hanna, and he is the Environmental Specialist 3 in the environmental permitting activity. Good? I think we got everybody. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Keith.
Yes. So, Bob, there's a lot to catch up. If you have things you would like to say, we need to give you that chance. Unmute yourself. Going once? Going twice? You need to unmute, Bob, if you have something to say. Or wave at the, can you see him? Are you looking at him on screen? Oh. Oh. Okay, we'll just keep going then with the wetlands. Thank you very much.
Okay, at the last meeting, the committee decided you wanted to have a presentation on wetlands. So we sent one out and here it is. So today we're going to be discussing the wetland protection standards of Chapter 50, the minimum standards that apply throughout the county. We've discussed the tree minimum standards, so it's very similar in the Chapter 72 implementing ordinance. You guys have seen some of these slides before, so some of them are copies. And Ginger can stop me if she wants to add anything or smack me. All right. Yeah. Oh, she doesn't need permission. She frequently, wow. Again, Keith Abramson, Environmental Permitting Manager, Volusia County Forester. So as you can see, from 1990 to 2020, the population grew by approximately 182,000 people. We've added approximately 81,000 homes, 18 million gallons of water usage per day, quite a few trips on the road. Here we have a slide showing the areas in 1990 that were in the city and versus the now 2020 areas that are incorporated into cities. They've doubled the total land that's in the city. Again, here's some a graph showing the population move or growth in the city areas. And the first thing we're talking about is in this presentation is the minimum standards. So we have the county has minimum standards that apply throughout Volusia County. And they require an implementing ordinance by the cities. Most of the cities have adopted an implementing ordinance. Oak Hill is one of the areas that doesn't have an actual implementing ordinance for wetlands or the class 2 areas, and we enforce the minimum standards in the city if the cities do not adopt an ordinance. But all of them except for Oak Hill have adopted a wetland ordinance. Yep.
Not to derail, but I am curious. The minimum standards were agreed to by all of the municipalities. And as you just said, some of them have their own implementing ordinances, which they enforce, or others can default to county for enforcement. I believe it was in 2009, City of Ormond Beach went back on their wetland regulations to be consistent with St. John's, which is a 19 county area, rather than the specific wetland regs that were written for Volusia County. I know at that time, the mayor urged the county to adopt the district regs as well, and the county chose not to. But how is it, if this is a long discussion, let's put it aside for later, but I don't understand how if the city signed on to these minimum standards, Ormond Beach could adopt something less restrictive.
Well, based on our conversation with Stephen Spraker, who's a planning director, they have a reference that requires minimum standards of to be implemented in the city. So they have not adopted a specific ordinance that replicates ours, but they adopted ours by reference. I'm not saying that's the perfect situation. I'm not saying that all the cities are necessary. They may have it in writing. Following.
Thank you, Clay.
Well, some of the cities have actually adopted or copied our ordinance. Some of the cities have adopted ordinances that do not meet our Chapter 50 minimum standards. Some of the cities have met those standards and simply don't enforce them. We have talked to all the cities multiple times, looked through their codes, and we have a list and we know who enforces it and who doesn't.
For a later date, I'm very interested. Thank you. And Sarah Lee, you had a question?
If there are significant distinctions between our Volusia County minimum standards and what the Water Management District requires, and what the Water Management District requires is less restrictive, we should understand that.
We'll help you with that.
Okay.
All right, so where was I? So I got a slide here about the importance of wetlands, help filter water, help provide habitat for native species, help provide clean water for shellfish harvesting in areas like that. Here's a slide basically about the economic value of wetlands. So we're getting to the minimum standards. It was adopted in 1989. It was last revised in 1999. This is where we get our no net loss of wetland acreage or function. It requires a wetland alteration permit for impacts to wetlands. It establishes mitigation requirements and avoidance and minimization. So that's important is the avoidance and minimization. The state doesn't necessarily apply avoidance and minimization. It also requires a 25-foot upland buffer.
Keith, a question on this. So this was adopted in '89 with the original goal has always been no net loss in either acreage or in the functions of
size
wetlands,
or
which you
function.
just described what the benefits of those are in a slide or two back. Have we been successful in our county of achieving that goal thus far of no net loss in wetlands? Do we know this? Do we have, I know that in '89 we didn't have GIS mapping.
Right.
So
I mean, as far as the unincorporated area, we collect mitigation and we utilize that mitigation for wetland creation and small lot acquisition that are in wetlands. We also, in the tree fund, we have a tree fund. It's similar to the tree fund. We discussed that. So we collect that mitigation monies and goes into a trust account. And we utilize that to either enhance, create, or purchase small lots.
but I'm actually asking if we do know, if we've been able to quantify as a county, whether we've lost any wetland acreage or lost any wetland function in the 30 years since this was adopted. Just
I
curious.
think it's hard to account for every square foot. I know over the last 5 years, we've had, I think, 692 wetland alteration permits. We've had roughly, 7.5 acres of wetland impact and about 12.5 acres of buffer impact in the unincorporated areas.
But we don't know in the totality of the county. We don't know what's gone on in the municipalities as more and more land has been annexed into them.
Right. Once they adopt their implementing ordinance, we don't see any of the reviews. We don't see any of the permits. We're not part of that process. And the only city that we're part of that process is Oak Hill.
Thank you. Wendy.
And I think it's important to understand that it's no net loss of acreage or function. So you could have a loss of acreage over the county, but because of the mitigation, they're saying that that function has been replaced. And that's the way the Water Management District is. That's the way the Army Corps of Engineers is also.
Yeah. I have seen mitigation out of basin, and that's a loss. To be honest with you.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because service area versus basin.
Right.
Pretty early on in our process, I pointed out that the last 2 years, we have seen an exponential increase in the amount of money in the tree fund, which was a piece of evidence that in fact we have taken down a lot of trees. What is the status of the wetland trust fund? Has it also seen an exponential increase in the amount of money that's sitting in it? Because that might be the answer to your question.
Yeah, there has been an increase. I believe it's close to 300,000. I don't know the exact number that's come in over the past couple of years. But I can get that number for you if you like.
I don't mean to sound like I'm beating up on county, because I'm not. This county has done many wonderful things and has many wonderful standards. It just is unfortunate to me that we established as a county reasons why we believe wetlands are important. We established a goal, but we're unable to effectively manage that goal in the totality of our area. So that's just, thank you so much.
I wanted to just also respond on the wetland and on the mitigation fund. So, I mean, we may talk a little bit more about this later, but so our ordinance requires mitigation for wetland impacts. It requires mitigation for buffer impacts. But what it doesn't require is mitigation for impacts that are already mitigated through some state process, right? So if a development has a Army or district permit or a DEP permit and they require mitigation, maybe it's bank credits, maybe it's, whatever the mitigation is, we don't require additional mitigation. So what we find when we look at all of our wetland alteration permits, which could be a buffer permit, right, is that when we collect money into our mitigation fund, it's almost always buffer impact mitigation, because most of the wetland impacts, the big wetland impacts, are handled by the state statute. So, so we don't get a ton of wetland mitigation money. It's for we get wetland mitigation money for the things that the state exempts, and we'll talk about what those things are. So our fund isn't necessarily like a great comparison to wetland impacts, because those bigger wetland impacts are typically mitigated some other way than our fund. And we'll issue a wetland alteration permit. And if we've done our jobs right, we've been able to move that house from the original proposed location of in the wetland to maybe it gets moved out, and now all we have are buffer impacts. And so just keep in mind that fund is both types of mitigation. So.
Thank you so much for that clarification. That's really helpful. And also, perhaps it's discussed later on, but in those big permits that are handled through the state or the district, those mitigations may not necessarily be in the basin, correct? Okay, thank you.
Well, I just, for clarification real quick, I checked, it's around 220,000 over the last 5 years. And like I said, that's some of it we didn't collect. What? Dollars, not in pesos. Yeah.
So with this standard being adopted in 89 and then revised in 96 and 99, in general, at least since I've lived here, and the size of these cities doubling as we have evidence of now, there is a very distinct difference between the wetland form, function, and size of, let's say, something in Tiger Bay versus in the middle of, say, Margaritaville, or what will be Margaritaville. So once that gets built out. But anyways, with that being said, that loss of acreage and function does happen in Volusia County. At least that's my humble opinion.
So do you guys cover the statutory definition of a wetland and upland? And okay, so I'm not going to go into any of that right now. I think that'll be important for our conversations later, that we're all speaking from the same language. Generally speaking, because wetlands have a lot of basis on water table, what we're probably talking about is loss of naturalized wetlands, loss of the functional value of wetlands. I think we have unnaturalized, I mean, all of our wet stormwater ponds have a perimeter that it doesn't develop into hydric soil unless you let things grow, but it borders on what a wetland is. And that is a lot of the challenge that these folks have, is the definitions from a legal perspective and what our code actually establishes as the required protection, and how do you define an avoidance and minimization. There are a lot of existing subdivisions of land that make a parcel very difficult to utilize with complete avoidance. And so that's where the minimization comes in. But, my opinion, your opinion, somebody else's opinion on that, it's not defined. I think that that's the area that we're going to find difficulty and also the most success in seeing change. So Just encouraging everybody to pay attention to those little nuances in the rules and the language.
Quick little thing, Bob texted me when he does hear things, his speakers just being a little weird. Please don't tell me.
Thank you. Bill?
So it is important that you're talking about the projects that are regulated by you versus the ones that are regulated by the state. And because state impacts, they are in the thousands of acres instead of, 7 acres you've had over the past however many years.
So all of them are regulated by
Us.
two, except for things that I should talk about. We track, so if we have a wetland alteration permit for a site that also has a state permit, we still in our database say there was 1 acre of wetland impacted. Just because we didn't get any additional mitigation, that was still an impact. So we are counting all of the wetland impacts in unincorporated Volusia County to the best of our ability, right? I mean, we had a lot of entries in the database, but so we are counting that as an impact, even if we aren't getting the mitigation.
I see. And then wetland impacts, they are always, the mitigation is always, at least for the water management district, in the same basin. You can't do mitigation outside the basin. So yeah, the service area or the hydrologic basin is where you have, the service area of the mitigation bank includes the drainage basin of the property that the mitigation bank is in. So it's always within that basin.
It's not the St. John's service boundary. It have to be in basin. There are for credits about a basin mitigation allowance, but like 6 credits or something to do it. It's because there was not mitigation available that met the TD that the state are in a time in basin. And so they won't approve it if there is an in-basin option.
Okay, so,
If-
all right,
if-
so to be
if you
clear, then
don't-
service area isn't the 19 county geographic area that the St. Johns River Water Management District oversees. It is the basin.
The hydrologic basin. that's
Hydrological
right.
basin.
And
Okay,
if you
thank you.
if you don't have a mitigation bank in that basin, you have to do on-site mitigation or find something in that basin to do. So you still offset that function in the basin.
I've seen it for saltwater mitigation go out of basin. I mean, I've seen it for saltwater mitigation go out of basin because there was no other option. So it does happen. Is it rare? Yes. But, I don't see just Tyler's project. I don't see just Bill's projects. I see all the projects. So, I get notified by DEP for what permits they're issuing. Most times, even in the cities, they're pretty good about notifying me of a permit that they're going to issue. Okay, so I think we covered this slide. Is there any more questions? No, okay. Okay, so as Ginger was talking about, there are some exemptions in Chapter 50. As you can see, timber catwalks, bona fide agricultural uses, maintenance, what Tyler was talking about, some of the retention ponds, we would, that's exempted under this portion of the code. So we even look at retention or detention areas for wetlands or surface waters. And here's an important one, wetlands and ½ acre or smaller. So if it's under ½ an acre, the total wetland size, not the wetland impact, but the total wetland size, it's exempted under Chapter 50. And another one is, and the cities are using this a lot, developments that have a valid ERP from the FDEP. So they take that to mean if there's a DEP permit, they don't have to do anything. And that doesn't mean that the DEP is taking care of the buffer mitigation. Sometimes they issue general exemptions, not permits. Sometimes there's no mitigation. There's another slide that has all those things in there, but those are important to recognize. And here's Chapter 72, some of the wetland standards that are in Chapter 72. So it eliminates that exemption for the state impacts. It has, the wetland buffer information in there in wetland alteration and mitigation sections. It mandates the avoidance and minimization of impacts. And it also increases buffers in NORMA, ECO, and OFWs.
So again,
That's just unincorporated. Number 72 and OCO. Because
And-
Chapter 50 requires an implementing ordinance.
And so just to be clear, in unincorporated Volusia County, if there's an ERP, or even in the cities, that is not necessarily protective of upland buffers, the 25-foot upland buffer, because that's a county requirement?
Sometimes the state requires secondary mitigation for secondary impacts. It's not on every project, but we do look at that. So if they have a project that has secondary impacts for upland areas, we don't double charge for that
But
mitigation.
if they don't, you would
But if
come
they
in
don't,
and,
we pick it up.
okay.
Right.
And
that's
then,
that's what the municipalities should be doing as well.
and then following on, if there are 50-foot buffers in Norma and Eco, but those are not necessarily honored in the city. That's only unincorporated Volusia County. Okay,
Correct.
Thank you.
And most of the time, if the state does attach buffers, they're usually, in either where from 15 or 25 feet. They're not 50, most likely.
So to clarify that, all ERPs require a minimum 15-foot, average 50-foot upland buffer so that you then don't have secondary impacts. So yes, ERPs do have buffers, but they're flexible. The county's buffers are 25-foot fixed. Is that right?
Correct.
And so that makes
Some
it
of them.
difficult to manipulate or work within the property without having an impact. So that's something we should talk about later.
Right.
And then the state does have some 50-foot buffers, not normally, but only for RHPZ, which is riparian habitat protection zone, or OFWs.
Right. And we do have one section that has 100-foot average buffers in Osteen. It's in the CR designation. So we have them that are larger than 50, but it's 100 average, which is a nightmare when you do average buffers because wetlands aren't in straight lines. To all the planners in the room.
I resemble that.
All right, wetland protection. So these are some of the things we've identified as potential improvements, and you may identify more as we go along into the ordinance sections later on. But we would like to, especially in Chapter 50, remove the DEP, FDEP permit exemption. Better define, like Tyler was talking about earlier, avoidance and minimization, because avoidance and minimization means different things to different people. Some people say, I've minimized it by 10 square feet. That's enough. Requiring, some of these were sent on a slide into council as well, but requiring permitting and mitigation upon conversion of ag land within a certain time frame. So like we discussed the 5-year time frame or the 3-year time frame going to a 5-year time frame in the tree ordinance for clearing of ag land. This would kind of be something that would be similar to that. If you cleared wetlands under an agricultural exemption, and then you come in next year and you want to build a house in that area, we would assume that you did it for the construction of the house. So that's something to think about. Do you want to increase buffers in ECO and NORMA? Like we said, we have that 100-foot buffer in the CR designation. We need to update the codes to meet the UMAM, Unified Mitigation Assessment Method. It's a mouthful. And just make it consistent with comprehensive plan and strengthen regulation for disturbance of buffers.
So that's the list that went to council when we were first discussing whether to have a committee to look at these things. So that's the same list that we sent to council is right here. I did want to just, okay. So when we're now thinking about it in the lens of Senate Bill 250, some of these things like updating to include the current mitigation method, right? The state identified, this is the way we will quantify impacts and required mitigation years ago. Our code still has an old way of assessing mitigation. Does not meet the state method. We use the state method as a matter of practice because we are required to, and it makes sense. But our code doesn't reflect that, right? So that's a change that it's not, more burdensome or whatever. It's just updating the code to be current practice. So now we're looking at it a little bit differently. So as we go through, we will probably all want to identify what type of change is this? Is this just, an administrative change or something to be current with state code? Or is this something that would be more protective of wetlands, which I guess under this language could be, more restrictive or burdensome, right? Maybe we make note of those as we go along. And so if we do presentation to council in the future, we kind of can say which things are which type of change.
The very first one up there, establish guidelines to better define avoidance and minimization. Would that be in the land development code and chapter 50 or okay, thank you.
Yeah, potentially both.
Both.
More restrictive or burdensome.
In the eye of the beholder as well, right? Because in our mind, we're saying, let's clarify what that means. You're an applicant, you know what we are going to be thinking when we're talking about avoidance and minimization. It may not actually, in practice, be more restrictive or burdensome. It may be what we do, but putting it down in words, in the eye of the beholder, right? Somebody could say that's more restrictive.
And there will be a ton of really creative arguments made along those lines too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So following that same thinking, the next to last bullet point, make changes to provide consistency with the comprehensive plan. I see that in council and in the city commissions all the time, these requests for changes to be consistent. And so, I would be very interested in updating the land development code to be consistent with the comp plan. Will 250 prevent us from doing that?
Yeah, that's probably the right answer. I'll be the typical lawyer here and just say it depends.
The planner's going to sit there and say, if you have a disagreement between the land development regulations and the comprehensive plan is the prevailing document. So I would sit there and say that if you're making something consistent with an existing set of goals, objectives, and policies that were established prior to Hurricane Ian visiting us, that it would not be deemed more restrictive or burdensome. It's just making sure it's consistent.
Well said.
Client attorneys.
Yeah, and it's here where we're talking about increasing the buffers, because that would be more burdensome, clearly. So would we put that in a voluntary form?
Well, of course, when we wrote this, we weren't thinking about
right.
250, and we had been hearing from the council and from the public that, particularly in eco, and we have some maps that we can show, that the intent is those are the areas that are afforded the most protection in the county. That, a 50-foot upland buffer is not sufficient to protect the water quality and wildlife functions of a wetland. And we've seen some studies, and that came up at council a couple of times, folks talking about our buffers are insufficient. So we put that out there as saying, hey, this is one of the things we can consider when we do the wetland ordinance. At the time, of course, we didn't have this restriction. So I don't know that there's going to be such a thing as a voluntary.
Yeah, I was thinking, how do you get to that?
And Jack, I think, and Jessica's going to probably say something smarter, a lot smarter than what I'm going to say, but I put myself in line first. To my mind, I think that we should still write down what our recommendation would be, so that at such time as the county council's allowed to consider it, this is what it would be. Jessica?
I was going to say exactly that. So we agree. Yeah, I think we can't burden ourselves with saying we can't be more restrictive because this rule is in place. By the time we're done, it's going to be October of 2024. And hopefully we're done before then, but it'll be in like planning board, right? PLDRC. So.
And
I
just
think
hope
that-
there's not another hurricane between now and then, within
And
100
another
miles.
session and another, you know.
Better than winning the lottery. Of course, we have other changes, just make it, flow better, kind of like we did with the tree ordinance, make things go in order, and make clear which sections apply at which time of the developments. It's kind of unclear now. Just remove redundancies. So here's a slide of our environmental core overlay.
And there, I will say this, there is comp plan language that says we will adopt higher environmental minimum area. I haven't really managed to accomplish that much, but that is a comp requirement.
Thank you. And it's you shades of. Well, then there's fine.
It just looks blue to me.
Yeah, the light blue is the water. Eco, yeah. Oh, yeah, I think it's because the water is on top. Yeah. We do have a map that we can click on and off layers. We can do that too.
Yeah. I think that'll be helpful, so you can turn them off and you can kind of see, and they overlay, yeah.
So,
Yeah. Doesn't
so we
yeah.
can understand the practical differences between ECO and NORMA. So ECO used to be something called MAP A, but ECO was adopted after NORMA was adopted.
Correct.
So just walk us through that, because it's not the last time we're going to be talking about it.
Okay, so the NORMA, Natural Resources Management Area, is the next.
Much larger area.
And those NORMA areas are only in the unincorporated county because it is a comp plan designation. It's an overlay in the future land use. So that exists only in the unincorporated area. And there are different standards in the comp plan for development within NORMA. And then the big distinction in the land development code is that instead of a 25-foot wetland buffer, there is a 50-foot wetland buffer. So NORMA has existed, I don't know how long, a long time. So then ECO was part of the initiative to identify interconnected lands in the county that deserved the highest protection. And you're right, at one point it was called MAP A. And the map was actually created using a GIS model that took our existing conservation lands and lands that had been identified as critically important to wildlife, and then used a model to create connections, right? So ECO is really about corridors and connecting large pieces of land. And ECO actually does exist in the cities. And it was intended to survive annexation. So if it was ECO in the county and it got annexed, it's intended to survive. Clay, I don't know. I can't speak to how well that's actually played out, that annexation part.
Well, for the last 7 years I've been here, I don't know anything. I mean, to be quite honest, it's been one of those things that as we proceed with annexations, we can go through and part of the process is after the annexation, the local government that's doing the annexation has to process comprehensive plan amendments, which would include changing the land use designation. When we get those through the BGMC, Village and Growth Management Commission, we can review that to determine if there's going to be significant differences between what we would have allowed through the NORMA as opposed to what the local governments are trying to do. Many local governments at some point in time will utilize the wetland maps to identify conservation areas. It's just the fullness of what we have in our NORMA overlay that may not be consistent.
And so in the Smart Growth Implementation Committee and in other prior groups that sort of looked at eco and NORMA and these same issues, the intent was that eco would be afforded the highest protection. Those are the areas that have been identified as critical. And there are comp plan policies that say, and we will adopt these higher standards in higher environmental minimum standards and in the land development code.
We also need to point out that map A was also some of the basis for the Pollution Forever acquisition, because that was the area that was targeted and utilized for establishing priority areas that contacting those property owners, see if they're being willing to sell. It's because, let's be blunt, regulatory aspect of control of wetlands can help out, but the ultimate protection is ownership.
Ownership,
So that's, I
yeah.
think you see that Volusia County was smart enough to have a dual process under that map A. So that that way those who are not willing to be willing sellers and participate in Pollution Forever, we at least would have some sort of regulatory protection.
And was all of that, then I know that the Volusia Conservation Corridor was based on the Environmental Greenway Network in great part, which is now talked about as what defines the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Was eco extends beyond that area, correct? It's not all Environmental Greenway Network mapping, is it?
It is not.
Cute.
Parts of the wildlife corridor are not in eco or NORMA.
And the Volusia Conservation Corridor was established prior to eco being established. So that was considered in the eco mapping effort because there was a presumption that at some point large tracts of land in that Volusia Conservation Corridor would be acquired through the Water Management District and Florida Forever and Volusia Forever. So connections to the conservation corridor were contemplated in eco.
One last question to try to visualize in my mind. Since eco is smaller than NORMA, are there areas of eco that are outside of NORMA, or is eco 100% contained within NORMA?
I can't say 100%. I believe that pretty much all eco is also NORMA. There may be some little areas on the margin.
Yeah, I think there are small areas that where NORMA is not in eco and eco is not in NORMA, but they're smaller areas.
And I think what you're hearing is that we are going to be doing the ground truthing now that we have better GIS data, plus we have these other projects, obviously with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, those types of things. It may cause for modifications to the NORMA boundaries, may cause some changes to the eco board.
Right, and we are mapping where eco, NORMA, and the wildlife corridor exist and looking at areas of wildlife corridor that aren't protected through NORMA or eco. And then we're having internal discussions about whether one or both of those maps needs to be inclusive of the rest of the Florida Wildlife Corridor.
Makes sense. Thank you very much.
Council comparison chart that we talked about earlier. Yep, pretty much everything that we had up there. Yes.
Could you please, the whole first part under the heading wetlands, that's all very clear and it's what we went over in the deck. Could you just speak a moment to whether it's a tag on or related or unrelated completely, the things at the bottom, protected species, stormwater and low impact development?
Yeah, that was just an add-on.
This is ignore.
Yeah, I couldn't
Okay.
cut that section out.
Yeah, that's a picture.
Yeah, that's a picture, so. So here we're talking about the comparison of the state versus Volusia County. So,
So there is state standard wetlands and they're there are two agencies that may implement that. And it just, the rules are the same. It just depends which agency you get is based on how they have administratively divided up the work. So DEP typically does single family, residential, the smaller type permits, and bigger permits like subdivisions or site plans or ag properties, those permits go to the water management district, but the standards should be the same at either agency. Yeah.
Yep, so as Tyler was saying earlier, we all go off of the wetland delineation of 62,340 of what an actual wetland is. We also have surface waters in our definition of wetlands. The state, we have our 1/2 acre or under exemption. The state doesn't have that. But the state does exempt 4,000 square feet of fill or less. And we see a lot of general exemptions under that exemption. So you could have 10 lots in a row, they have 3,500 square foot of wetland fill, and they can get a general exemption to fill that lot under that exemption.
So in this chart, we had where the state standard is more restricted, which we should have updated because that was before we added the 4,000 square foot of fill in wetlands. So in one way, we're more restricted in that any wetland impact requires a permit and mitigation, except that we exempt as a whole wetlands less than 1/2 acre or 1/2 acre or less. So I don't know, it's kind of a wash. The state does not exempt those smaller wetlands, but they do exempt these 4,000 square foot impacts that we get.
So any wetland under the state, any wetland larger than 4,000 square feet, any wetland can be impacted up to 4,000 square feet, whereas we require avoidance and mitigation on every wetland except those wetlands that are 1/2 acre or smaller. Is that? Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify that a little bit more. That's all, I'm relating it for the board for discussion later. It's almost like when we talked about tree preservation on individual lots versus when you develop overall, right? Because when you're going to these agencies for permitting, it's not going to be this lot is 3,500 under this permit. It can be absolutely, there is that loophole. But when you're looking at typical development, you're getting a permit for fill for the entire development. So you're not going to fall within that 4,000 square feet.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Right.
Right. One, right.
Same builder. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because individually they're under the.
Because it's one wetland, it's
Right.
larger than 1/2 acre.
Yeah, we
Right.
would pick up the mitigation on that, and, require avoidance and minimization. Mhm. Typically for single family residents, the state exempts docks over 1,000 square feet or less, 500 square feet in OFWs. We require mitigation for any impact according to the code. So any dock, any size. Now, if you have a dock and you're replacing the dock, we don't require mitigation for the same footprint. So it has to be above and beyond what was already previously permitted. So we're definitely more restrictive in that state. Seawall permits, the state exempts a lot of connect the dot seawalls, whereas we don't. We have portions of the code that don't allow for seawalls to be constructed on naturally occurring water bodies, and the state typically doesn't. So we're a little bit more, a lot more restrictive in that sense as well.
How does that impact single-family lots in unincorporated Volusia County along the Halifax River, for instance? Is Halifax River not considered a naturally occurring water body?
It has to be a NORMA. It has to be a NORMA.
Okay.
Or in the Class 2 area. So that's in those
Okay.
two areas. So
See,
and
yeah,
it has to
sorry.
be in the unincorporated area as well. So if you're in the city, it doesn't apply. Yeah, and then we discussed first earlier, typically 15, we see an average of 25. They can be as much as 50 as Bill said for the state, but that's really not typical of what we see. And like we had discussed earlier, we have 25 and 50, and then some areas are an average 100 foot. Any questions? Did I hit all the topics? Yeah, questions? No, this one. Oh yeah, this avoidance minimization, we really apply avoidance minimization. The state, I rarely see that be part of their permitting process. We talked about the uniform mitigation assessment method. Our code currently doesn't mention that, but we do apply it and utilize UMAM for our mitigation for wetlands, but not for buffers.
But to clarify, we require mitigation for buffers.
Yeah, we don't use UMAM for buffers. Yeah, a lot of the permits for the state are self-certification, people sitting in their permits. We have compliance inspections, we have permit inspections, we have boots on the ground. We go out in anytime anybody's building pretty much anything. We have layers that trigger our wetland inspections. Our inspectors go out, we check for wetlands. No one from the state is really doing that on a permit by permit basis. They're typically, you self-certify or apply for a permit, or they get a complaint that something's already happened, then they send someone out and there's a compliance issue. And then, what? Maybe they call us and ask us to go out. And then for mango trimming, we don't require permits for mango trimming, but it kind of falls under any work within a wetland. So we kind of have worked that in there. We don't really have mangrove standards. Yes.
That confused me a lot because,
Well, the state has sole control over mangrove trimming.
okay, there was that
Right.
homeowners association that hired a tree service a while back and was fined because they cut down a whole bunch of mangroves. That was then reported to FDEP, and FDEP came in and fined them.
Yeah, typically what we'll get is we'll get a complaint and we'll come out, we'll take a look. If it's a mangrove trimming, we'll contact DEP. DEP will say, yeah, we issued a permit for that. They'll come out and do an inspection, and then typically we'll say, well, they should have gotten a wetland alteration permit from us to do, work in the wetland. A lot of times we'll make them, come in and get a wetland alteration permit, but we don't issue specific permits for mangrove trimming.
I also thought that I saw on the Volusia County website at some point when I was looking at these things for whatever reason, that on let's say an individual lot that's on the river and has mangroves, that it's okay for that homeowner to trim to 6 feet or something like that, 6 feet, 15 feet.
It depends
5
on,
feet.
it depends on how high they are, and there's a lot of criteria that go with trimming mangroves.
It's
And
not.
It's not. It's pretty involved.
DEP regulates mangrove trimming, and there's just different levels. You can trim if they're between 6 and 8, no permit required. You can't do it if they're less than 6. If they get over 6 to 10, you have to have an arborist to help you make sure you don't kill it. And then if they're over 10, you can't do it at all.
Yeah.
So there are definitely state DEP regulations in place. It's very well.
Either an arborist or a PMT, a professional mangrove trimmer. And then there are vista, you can do like vista pruning to get a view through them in certain areas. And like Bill said, if it's over 16 feet, you're pretty much not going to get a permit to trim them. That's when you have to get a permit to do the vista trimming, because mangroves don't coppice well. I mean, they don't heal well. So, I mean, you start chopping on them, they die pretty quickly. Yeah, it's a whole thing. Any other questions? Like we
I
discussed
have a-
earlier,
I have a comment. Back to the avoidance minimization. The state does require avoidance minimization. It's actually called elimination and reduction. The feds do avoidance minimization, but they do have out provisions, which means that if you use a offsite mitigation bank and if the mitigation is higher value than the impacts, then you aren't required to do elimination and reduction. The feds do avoidance minimization, and they used to be very active in actually making you avoid and minimize until the program got delegated to FDEP. Correct. And now you still have to do avoidance minimization, but it's in the form of an alternative sites assessment. So it has gone away a little bit, actually quite a bit. The county does avoidance minimization, but to a very extreme level. And Keith, and it comes down to Keith to say, I think you are avoiding and minimizing or not, redesign your plan. And it really is so intense that that's what really makes people want to annex out so that they can get out of this county requirement.
it's my fault.
So I was going to say, and we talked about interpretation. So the comp plan, just so we have this when we're moving forward, because we're not revising that. The comp plan standard for is it unavoidable is a lawyer's field dream because it's restriction of attainment of reasonable use. What does that mean? Who's to say? Right? And so that's the level you're working with. So it's restriction of attainment of reasonable use. And so I think there's interpretation on both sides, and it does say no net loss in the comp plan. It clarifies that. And so I think that we can only operate under the comp plan in terms of implementing our land development code. And so I think the no net loss is not something that Keith gets to decide. That's what the comp plan says. But that standard on avoidance is very vague. And so I think if there's anything we can do to help clarify what that means.
In chapter 72, there are standards for review, and it talks about whether or the extent to which the activity has to occur in the wetland. And so, I mean, typically what we'll do, let's talk about a single family house. If there is an area of that property that you can put the wetland on, or the house on, even if it requires maybe a setback variance or something, right? You can move it into the setback, which would require variance. We're going to look for people to do that. If you're building on a lot that has significant wetlands and you're zoned for single family, we're not going to tell you you can't build a house, but we might say you don't have a pool or some other accessory structure in the wetland or in the wetland buffer. So we have typically really looked at no net loss as our avoid as the first option, minimize or mitigate. And so, yeah, I would say, I wouldn't say it's all Keith's fault that people are annexing into the cities, but I would say that our ordinance, and we do take a ordinance on minimization seriously in Bush.
Yeah, and my decision can be appealed by the DRC. So if someone feels aggrieved, if they think I'm being too tough, they can always appeal my decision.
Tyler has a comment, and then I would suggest, because we're kind of at the halfway point, that we take just a quick break. If that sounds good after Tyler.
Yeah, so I would tend to agree with Bill and Ginger on this and say that Volusia County does take a stricter definition of avoidance and minimization, and a lot of that discretion is to Keith or the staff in that group that are involved with the permit reviews. And that's why I was saying that definitions are something that's going to be important. I don't think that anybody's in disagreement on that. I don't necessarily think that the small sites are where this is as big of a problem. When you have a site that's 50 acres, that it has 10 acres of wetlands on it, if you save 8 of those, have you avoided the impacts greatly enough if it allows you to fit an industrial complex on that site now, and it would have to not function in the same utilization of the land otherwise? And that's where I'm not an attorney. I didn't write the code. I'll have a client that will come forward with a project. They're proposing something and we get to Keith, and then Keith and I are, good adversaries at that point. where I'm working for a paycheck. I'm just trying to fit the rules and regulations, and the rules are a little unclear, and the state says, here's your permit. And my client doesn't know whether Keith's an asshole, whether I'm incompetent, or whether this is how it's supposed to happen. And so to me, that is where Bill's right. Like it motivates all of those clients of ours to go, okay, screw Volusia County, I'm going somewhere else, and either build not in Volusia County or annex out. And it's not that Keith is a jerk, it's just that he's doing his job. So that's my comment.
It's really Todd.
Yeah.
Huh?
It's really Todd.
Okay. Knowing you all as I do, I'll say 10 minutes. Yes. Are you a nation girl? The reason You did something wrong in the past. It was last Friday. Yeah. Those are your time sheet. Yeah. I wondered why. Yeah. I just, and that's gonna. Yeah, one day, I can see. That's one of the. Yes. And I did love this.
That's the thing that's hurting these moves.
Yeah.
If everybody went up tomorrow, it was just looking for a job. And air travel increases, solar radiation hitting our decreases, and that is a lot more. Yeah, COVID, we saw over changes in the term. So we just do one of these calderas and block out the sun for a few
Like it's, this is the problem. I want sea level to rise so that everything else is rebuilt because the land comes back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Florida's only had its current code for the last 5,000 years. I mean, that's why Cal's got a big lease. I'm trying to do this. I live on the land bridge. That was a deal. You see my early insurance.
That's exactly. So I have an extra property for most people.
I got waterfront property in Barber. I got oceanfront property in Barber. Just gotta wait.
You're gonna wait a couple longer years. Accelerate stuff. See, that's exactly. Accelerate global and then the Outer Main Street has even more. But.
Magnify class of inflation.
No, I mean, you're driving your truck every day, you're accelerating.
Yeah. See, I live in the city that I work in, so I can drive large vehicles, less to the environment. That was my theory a long time ago.
If the county is saving more, I
don't think I'm gonna go against this marketing council. It's probably gonna be the Mach-E because it's cheaper than the Lightning.
Now, but can you put a baby seat in a Mach-E? Because you can't put a baby seat in a.
No, I bought my wife.
Tesla.
No, I'm not. I don't want electric forever. It's my office car. I don't leave Florida. I'm not reading. Yeah, I mean, we go on road trips. I couldn't imagine. I sit at the front of charger.
I'm always on the road trip. I trip towing a boat. So I can get 80 miles.
Still looking about the keys and looking forward to the 3 fuel stops.
Yeah. Took our last right now.
That's what I should say.
Yeah, I was smart. I just rented them.
That's what I said. That's too expensive.
Well, I don't do it at night. It's basically what's home restrictions. You can't go here. You can't go here. You can't go here. You can't go to night. You can't do this.
I know.
It's a piece of junk, and if it sinks, I don't care. I'm gonna get it down there, and then we'll see if it comes back with me.
I've read this letter as well. But yeah, it takes at night.
Yeah, I did a rental in Coral. It was nice, and the boat was nice, and it was great. I didn't see anything.
Right.
It's like, oh, it's not really, I didn't get that. I was there till 5, and it's now.
Yeah.
What's in the park?
Very thoughtful. That bill specifically was adopted because like 2 jurisdictions had moratoriums and they were like, we don't like them.
Yeah.
So it was for moratoriums, they just dropped it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
And-
I think.
Grr. I like your epics. It is huge. Okay.
That's the end of the wetland presentation, but we wanted to talk about what, what-
Coming in line with the comp plan or coming along with the state standards, how would you advise us?
Well, I think that this is a great time for just the committee discussion about the things that we identified at the council level a while ago, see if those are things that you all want to focus on. I mean, really, it's open for discussion right now. Like we said, we're not probably going to draft any actual language until we get direction from the county council. But where we would head with this is over this meeting or however many meetings it takes, come up with concepts that you want to recommend to the council, and we would do a presentation for discussion to them.
So does everyone have their PowerPoint? That would be what would be found on the, it says county council work plan with, or should we
Wanna
put
go
that
back
up
to
here?
that slide?
Jessica?
Yeah,
Yeah.
back.
There, so it's everything.
That guy.
Mhm.
We also have the map that we can switch between Norm and Eco if you want us to look at that. We also have the UMAM section if you want to look at the mitigation requirements. We also have 62340 that you can look at, which is the definition of wetland. I don't know if you want to get that involved within it, but if there's anything you want to see, we have those things we can pull up.
So what I was getting at is things like adopting UMAM, I would expect to kind of just be a, yeah, let's go forward and do that. So I was sort of suggesting that we separate our time into things that are likely to be approved by everyone on this committee, and then have discussions about things that are more contentious, perhaps. Tyler.
So in the definition of a wetland, one of the things that Keith mentioned is that Volusia County's wetland definition includes surface waters. And so we've talked about wetland impacts and how they're permitted. And I don't put together the forms or deal with the credits for this, so I'm going to have to hand the baton to somebody else. But there is a difference in the state and how those are treated in the mitigation that's required for them. And I think that that's a more substantial difference in the two code sets than what even I had realized before this meeting. Bill?
Yeah, 62340 does have a surface water definition in it. And it's just that typically you don't have to mitigate for surface water impacts. Whereas in the county code, I think we have had experiences where you've had to mitigate and avoid surface water impacts. Surface waters are typically ditches, swales, things that are man-made. And they have definitions with the side slope. If it's steep, you go up to the top bank. If it's a swale, you go up to the limits of the hydric vegetation. So that's the surface water.
If you look at the exemptions, I just scroll two up here. It has maintenance and ditches, retention, detention areas. So we don't really have to mitigate for ditches or retention areas impacts. We're talking more about, permitting a dock on the Indian River Lagoon. Does that require mitigation, or should it require mitigation? I think so. I mean, it's an impaired waterway. I mean, I think, protecting our waters are important.
So can you clarify a little bit more? So if ditches and retention and detention areas are exempt in terms of wetland protection, are they also exempt if you impact their hydrologic function? I mean, if a ditch is meant to drain something and you block a ditch or you fill a ditch, is that still allowed in terms of just flood mitigation, but not wetland mitigation?
We look at it says maintenance. So we kind of look at it maintenance as, if you had a ditches become filled in over time, we would allow you to dredge the ditch out to the original depth and width. When you go from taking a ditch to a canal, then we have an issue.
It's an assumption that the impacts were previously permitted and mitigated correctly, or that they were grandfathered during the creation of the regulations. And so you have some ditches that are out there that Cowboy put in, last month, that it's not permitted, it's not allowed. That is not something that would be exempt, because it will.
I just want to, I think I'm asking Keith, when we talk about wetlands there and we talk about drainage structures, I think there is a elevated standard for like floodways and floodplains in terms of avoidance. And so I think that's important to understand as we're talking about that specifically. So I don't know if we could touch on, because I think you have to completely avoid. You don't have a minimization effort there.
Flood pathways,
Floodway.
the wetland ordinance.
Right.
That's in the.
Yeah, so
like, I
floodway
know Sam knows.
minimization,
Yeah.
that's going to be within Division 7 of our Land Development Code, which is our floodplain management section. Then if you're filling a ditch, not necessarily in a floodway that's designated by FEMA, that's also going to be covered within the stormwater division of our code. So you can't be filling in any type of low area or ditches or anything like that without a stormwater management permit from the county. And you can't fill in any type of floodplain area without a floodplain permit from the county. But that is separate from the wetland portion of the code.
That's very useful. Thank you. Yeah, okay. And another topic for another day, I guess. My second question was, and I think I've already forgotten it. What was my first question? I'm having another one of those days where, okay, the first question was about ditches. Oh, the second question, totally unrelated. And I'm kind of looking at Tyler and Bill on this. So there's the National Wetland Inventory that is done by U.S. Fish and Wildlife or USGS or whatever. Is that how we're defining wetlands here, or is there some other? Okay, so yeah, somebody back up and explain how we're designating wetlands here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's, so 62-340 is a Florida administrative code. It defines the way you define a wetland in the state. It's for wetlands and surface waters, and the counties have to abide by that. Recently, when the Corps was using the 87 delineation manual with several lawsuits, that helps define what's WOTUS, but they recently delegated authority to the DEP because we have 62-340, and they said, oh, well, 62-340 is just as good as our delineation methodology, so we're going to allow you to do our Section 404 program if you use 62-340. So everybody in the state is using 62-340 except for retained waters, which are 300 feet adjacent to navigable waterways where the Corps still claims jurisdiction, and they use their own delineation, which is very similar to 62-340.
That helps a lot. That helps me.
Yeah, we use the NWI as a guide, as there may be wetlands there. The NWI says there are wetlands and spots that aren't field verified, and so we're always going out and field verifying. We also use the St. John's wetland layer as well.
Those are mainly put on out for the public for generalized due diligence, so that if a non-practitioner of land development is looking at a piece of property and they're able to get on our GIS layer or our interactive map, it gives them an idea of where it is. It's not used for permitting at all.
And I'll just add too, just so that you understand our process a little bit. So if someone comes in and applies for a building permit or primarily building permit, we've identified where we think wetlands might be based on soils and vegetation. So we have this layer that we call environmental review required. And when someone applies for a permit, that automatically, if you're in that area, it automatically triggers a wetland review in our management system, right? So that we get alerted that there might be a wetland there. But that's really just an indicator of the fact that we need to go out and look and make sure whether there's a wetland. And then, if there is in fact a wetland, we use the state required delineation method.
And then just the process is that they will say to the builder, you need to go out and get a delineation. Whoever it is, the consultant will do the delineation. If they have a wetland, then they will have to go to DEP if it's a single family and permit it with DEP. and then either mitigate for it or not mitigate for it because it's exempt. And then you come to the back to the county and say, we've already done our state permitting, give us a building permit. And then the WAP, I guess, is automatically done based on the DEP permit.
We'll
Is
do
that
it
right?
concurrently. We'll,
Yeah.
we'll work with them at the same time. We don't want it to, we really can't hold up our permits for a state permit. So we typically work concurrently, but not all property that has a wetland, we require a delineation. If you've got 10 acres and you're far on the other side of the wetland, I mean, there's no sense in doing it. It's only when you're going to get close or you're going to be impacting the wetland or buffer that we really require the delineation.
Conclusion? We, but that's dictated by the state? Okay. Or circulate it.
It's a lot. So there's 4 different criteria. It's an A, B, C, and D test. The A test is based on obligate vegetation greater than upland. The B test is obligate and fact wet is more than 80% of the vegetation of, and this is all starting from the canopy going down. Both the A and B test needs to have either a hydrologic indicator or a hydric soil. Then the C test is if you're in a mapped soil unit, but it's in an undrained condition. So, and it's not a flatwoods or a pasture. And then the D test is if you have a standalone hydric soil. So some of the soil in situ, not in mapped unit, but if you have, there's like 5 different things. Mucky texture, 2 inches, stained sand that's 4 inches deep, glade soils, things like that, then you can actually say it's a wetland based on the soil alone, the existing soil. And they do that sometimes. So those are the 4 things that get you a wetland.
Yep. So basically, what is the vegetation, the kind of vegetation that typically grows in a wetland, and there's percentages, is the soil, a wetland type soil, hydric soil, and then is the hydrology such that there's water there?
Or other hydrologic indicators. Well, some of your indicators can be elevated lichen lines. It could be adventitious roots. It could be a lot of different things. It could be, yeah, buttressing and yeah.
The landward extent of wetlands as defined in the subsection shall define reasonable scientific judgment. This is the method. To evaluate the dominance of plant species, soils, and other hydrologic evidence of regular and periodic inundation and saturation. And so these are the lands between our low water mark and our high water mark. They're inundated for long enough to change the plant, little things that can't survive underwater.
Or saturated. Yeah.
So, yeah, after a major event, like we saw, that standing water in places that weren't perhaps previously indicated as wetlands, would they now be considered wetlands if the vegetation died and is beginning to be colonized by wetland vegetation from previously defined wetlands?
It's possible,
Okay.
but typically it's not, doesn't stay there for months and months. If you had asked a water management district employee or DEP employee to come out and look at it, let's say in month 2, and it still had water on it, then yes, they would definitely try to claim it.
Then a year later, if it dries back out and everything dies and it's back to upland, you can contest it.
That's right.
Yeah, they would come back out. The only thing that would be a binding formal determination from Tallahassee would make it binding.
So the reason that I wanted to discuss this is because wetland lines are not fixed lines on the ground. They're very much continuously evolving. And what we do to the land, whether we touch the wetland or not, how we change the water flow across the surface and underneath the surface will affect those boundary lines.
That's right. And we're seeing that everywhere.
And we're seeing wetlands created.
Yes.
We didn't anticipate them as much as we're seeing them, or I shouldn't say as much as, but as well as seeing them drain.
Yes.
So it's a function of groundwater that creates wetlands.
Yes.
I haven't seen a large growth of wetlands. I've seen a lot of inundation because of storms, and Bill, he's out there, he's doing these delineations as well. I mean, I don't think there's a huge like explosion of wetlands being, new wetlands everywhere. Have you found the same thing? Yeah, yeah.
So all that flooding was very temporary.
Yeah.
And so it's going to go back down in a month or so, and then there's not going to be, takes a while for the hydric soil indicators to show up in the soil.
Right.
And so you would go to that spot and you would look around and you'd say, yeah, the water killed some of the trees, but pretty much everything else is upland vegetation. It did not have enough time to develop hydric soil criteria.
Right.
This is not a wetland. But if it stayed long enough, 6 months, then the wetland will develop and become a wetland. But you're right, they have not grown.
Yeah. You're the biggest. Yeah. Where you see a rapid development of wetlands is typically in hydric pine flatwoods. When someone comes in and clears it and just walks away from it and they don't fill it and they don't plant anything back, it develops into a hydric pine flatwood, really, really quickly. Yeah. 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 I see that happen a lot, but that's not done in mass. I mean, yeah.
So Wendy, you still have that's all right. So now that we have discussed and defined what a wetland is, and that was very interesting. Thank you, everyone. Shall we return to the page that we were looking at that requires decisions of us eventually? Yes. Sorry. Mhm.
Can I respond to the average buffer thing? We've, of course, over the years have talked about this a number of times. Are there better ways to calculate buffers? Regardless of the size, is a set buffer or an average buffer the way to go? Here's the staff perspective on that, and take it as you will. The issue with an average buffer is that in some places on a site plan, you could have the development right up against the wetland. And you may make up for that by having more buffer somewhere else. But the biological reason to have a buffer is to have a distance between that impact and the wetland, right? The buffer is intended to protect the wetland from the impacts of the development. So if you have the development in an area right up to the wetland, you're not protecting it anymore in that spot, even if you add more buffer somewhere else. So for us, we felt like the way that we do it now is appropriate. What the number is may vary, but that should be a minimum buffer just to protect the wetland and provide that wildlife habitat corridor, all of the things that buffers do. That's not to say that, and as we discussed, we wouldn't permit an impact into the buffer. We do that if in fact you have a site where you just for whatever reason cannot avoid and minimize that, incursion into the buffer, we'll permit that and require mitigation. But having more buffer somewhere else isn't necessarily more beneficial in our opinion.
And the maximum is $1 a square foot, and no one ever gets to $1 a square foot. It always ends up being 50 or 60 cents a square foot. So it's really cheap. It's probably too cheap, but so it's not like it's insurmountable.
So Bill brought up some things for discussion, which has just begun here. Do we want to knock some things off of here too? Like, for instance, would anybody object to updating to include UMAM, to include the current mitigation assessment method? Is that controversial at all? Okay, so let's
Need a
done.
motion to update the code to incorporate or to ask staff to provide proposed language to update the code to include UMAM as is required by the state. The second item that I hope we don't have controversy on is to ask staff to include a more detailed definition of the intent of the minimize and avoidance.
That's two motions or one motion?
One motion.
You were doing great with one.
I think we're gonna have to talk about avoidance and minimization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you like to amend your
I'll amend
motion?
to just have one item.
Thank you. So, anyone second that?
Second, on the UMAM.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, so staff will draft language. Is there anything controversial about making changes to provide consistency with the comprehensive plan?
Oh,
Bill?
Yeah, I don't understand what that means.
Okay. Okay. What else on here would be actionable today then?
I still think asking them to what they mean is not controversial.
Oh.
What that definition is, to talk about it, yes. Yeah, okay.
Trying to motion.
Okay.
Okay. Definition of, again, please state.
Like to amend my not seconded original motion to include asking staff to define how they are applying avoidance and minimization today in greater detail. Because it's different from the other avoidance and minimization standard. Do you feel it's well defined today, Bill? You've got a face. No, that's
Okay.
just define how it's being applied today so that we can discuss it, so that there is points of discussion.
Okay, so to be clear, Tyler has made a motion to ask staff to come back to define what avoidance and minimization as currently practiced is so that we can discuss it. Do we have,
as well as incorporating the UMAM?
well, we already voted on that, so this is a standalone. Any second to
No
Tyler's?
second.
Oh,
I don't know that they all need to be a motion. I think we can
Right.
just ask you, yeah.
okay,
That's-
good. No.
We had previously discussed that because of the committee that we any requests as a committee staff that we had to have a current statement.
Yeah.
The other item was how would we be updating the code to be matched with the comp plan? What were the specific areas?
The suggested buffer increases for Normal and Echo, what we have now versus what those changes would be. And I have a question on the disturbance to buffers. What's the current problem we're facing that we're trying to answer on disturbance to buffers?
You could probably recommend putting in there like a minimum, like if it's a 25-foot, maybe they're only allowed to impact half of it. And there's a hard line there. If it's 50-foot buffer, maybe they're only allowed to impact 25 feet of the buffer. For ancillary structures like pools.
But I think the question, I'm sorry, Keith, I think the question Jessica was getting at, always talk to the dummy in the room, which would be me. What's going on in the buffers that needs to be
That's what
fixed? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is people, they're wanting to put sheds in the buffer. They want to put them, they want to put pools in the buffer. We typically allow them to impact by practice half of the buffer. But there's nothing in there that says you can't impact more than half of the buffer. Typically, we would just deny the permit and they would have to take it to DRC to appeal our decision. But that's one way that you could strengthen disturbances to the buffer.
Okay, thank you. Jessica? Oh, Bill, sorry, you were up before, I think.
So not only do we have a buffer that's fixed, but now we're talking about adding more regulations so that now you can impact that buffer and you can get a permit to impact the buffer, but they're talking about saying no, putting it in the rule that you can't go beyond a certain amount of that buffer impact, which would effectively mean you couldn't impact the wetland.
Well, you can always, I think we're talking about for developed site where there's accessory structure reviews. I think it would be a very defined case if it was to be brought back.
Yeah, we kind of left it open-ended so you could discuss it and you could tell us, if you had ideas or things that you would like to see, and we could come back with them. I mean, you could also, and strengthen regulations maybe to increase the mitigation costs. There are other options.
So, and let me ask, the disturbance to the buffers, do you see that most on your level on a single homeowner?
Yeah.
Case by case? That's what
Yeah.
I say, because when you're coming in for the overall development, if you've got buffer impacts, you're getting a wetland alteration permit for everything right off the bat.
Yeah, this is
Even
death
if
by
it's
1,000 cuts.
Right. So it's single owner occupied, whatever, coming in and saying, I want a pool there, can we modify it? Right.
And to your point, yeah, so we have struggled with this in the past too, like if you mitigate for the wetland, if you impact the wetland, buffer still exists and right, like we've had these same conversations. So what we're not proposing is to say you can only impact half of the buffer, which therefore is a hard stop to get to the wetland, right? If you can demonstrate avoidance and minimization and you have to impact the wetland, that's where we are in mitigation. So there's not an intent to use the buffer as a stop to get into the wetland. We don't want to get to the wetland, but.
Are you trying to define what would be exemption for with this, are you trying to strict? Basically, I'm trying to figure out what this test on, is this year actionable or next year actionable? Are you trying to increase the restriction, or are you just trying to define an exemption that maybe decrease the restriction?
I think anything that would strengthen that regulation would be an increase, and it would have to go next year. But there are exemptions to the buffer, like 500 square feet of access to open water, 25 foot or less. So you get people who want to, they've got a small buffer, they clear 25 feet of it for access to open water. That's not really providing a lot of protection to the buffer. So maybe they can have 500 square feet, but maybe it's, could meet like an ADA requirement where it's 6 feet or less. So they could clear a path to get to the waterway and not have a 25-foot wide area that they cleared for access to open water. So there are a lot of things that we could do with the current code, but yes, it would be an increase.
I was going to say, because I see it as an increase too, because I think it's not an exemption, right, by the book, but it's something that in practice, it's a single owner. You want them to have the same rights as properties around them. That's probably why it happens. So I completely get it. I think it would make sense if we can clarify on owner occupied or accessory structures, that kind of methodology, to say, we understand you want this, but you bought your house knowing there's a wetland here, knowing there's a required buffer. You can't just do whatever you want to put in a pool. So that would be.
That to come back with. Anything else? The requiring permitting and mitigation upon conversion of agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. Jessica?
Yeah, my question on that is if, as a baseline, because I think 10 years is huge, but as a baseline, I think it's the same logic as tree preservation that we already went through on rebuttable presumptions. And if it's a bona fide ag use and they prove that up, that's something that I would be interested in seeing some draft language on if we were to mimic that approach. But I think a look back of 10 years regardless is extreme.
Do we know how long Farmington's been in the works? Much longer than 10 years? Okay.
Yeah, Margarita.
That hurts me. Not pay for anything.
I think it's a policy decision on, do we want all of these exemptions for agricultural bona fide pursuits? We say we do all throughout our code. If we do, are we going to slap them on the wrist for 7 years down the road, their farm is not viable anymore and they sell to a developer? That happens. So, right.
Well, in the tree code, we would. We have a 3-year rebuttable presumption, which
can prove that they were there for ag and it's not a business.
you can try to rebut the presumption, but it's ultimately up to me.
But we've heard Keith is tough.
Bless.
That gets back to, do we penalize or incentivize?
I have a question on the wetland ag exemption. I'm not aware of it. You can't just go bulldoze wetlands and regrade ag land without a permit.
Well,
Can you?
our code exempts bona fide agricultural use.
Not in the state of Florida.
Right, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to follow the state rules. So we've had a rash of people, who read our code, go out there and, start digging ponds or digging in the wetland, turning soil, dredging. We call St. John's. St. John shows up. They're like, you have a violation. They're like, I'm ag. I don't understand this. And then they start the restoration process. So yes, it gets them out of our code, but not the state. But the state code is, they can clear every bit of vegetation off of it as long as they don't dredge or rip the stumps out. So they can cut it off level with the ground. The biggest cypress tree in the world, they can cut it right off and they're fine.
Trees are not protected by the state under ag, but wetlands are protected. Damage is enforced. This would just be changing the county interpretation.
The state.
So there's not, I just want to make sure everybody understands, there's not the giant loophole that I can go buy property, call it ag, do whatever the heck I want to it, and just destroy all environmental component of it. I can only do that with the plant life that's on it.
Yeah, they protect the hydrology, not the plants.
The one thing that we're continuing to have problems with is the general public who buys A1, 2, 3 property. Well, I've got ag land, so I'm reading your code, I'm exempt. They're not realizing it's for bona fide agriculture where you have an ag class given to you by the property appraiser based on the fact that you have in operation a true pasture, a true silviculture operation. So that's where you see a lot of folks get astray of our code because they go by solely our zoning.
Mhm.
And there are plenty, especially in the rural areas of Volusia County, that it's just an enforcement issue that St. John's will never know, right? And so they do think that because the county code has an exemption that they do, and we have to clean those messes up a bit. A lot.
So you're saying we already have this covered? It's just there's a misinterpretation by the landowners.
We want to make sure if there's any ambiguous statements in the code that we get rid of that, and then also ensure that we have better education programs as best we can. You know, again, at times we load our websites up with so much information, I think it becomes confusing to try and find the information.
Oh, yeah.
So,
So Clay, so the question was some examples of the problem. And you said it's generally with single property owners who are misinterpreting that just because you bought land that's in an agricultural zoning does not mean that you're a bona fide agricultural operation. So that's a problem with their due diligence that they've done upon their purchase. So what I would perhaps like to see, since this isn't an area of expertise for me at all, I'm a great test case. Do I understand how this is written? You know, if the issue that we have is that, and we need language to address it better, then put it to the John Q. Public test.
and also making sure that property owners of agriculturally zoned properties, when they are searching out to become bona fide agricultural uses,
That they're
understand
clear.
that there's state requirements that are not necessarily exempted
So-
by our standards.
And Bliss, you're in real estate, correct? That reminds me too of how many times where I live, we have a very small HOA. All we do is maintain a beach walkover and some benches at the river. That's it. Nothing else but you want to use those things, which are amenities. They're a selling point for the homes. If you want to use them, you have to pay for your HOA fee. Some of the realtors don't inform the potential buyers. Is there an onus upon real estate people who are selling these properties, these ag zoned properties? Is there an onus upon them to disclose that?
Not only on the real estate agent, but on the sellers themselves.
Okay. Thank
You
you.
have to disclose.
Thank you.
All right, for the ag stuff, for instance, this is a property we have been involved in recently. This area right here was cleared under an ag exemption, and this road was installed through this wetland system, and this canal was dredged. We've been working with St. John's with this, and technically, they have an agricultural exemption. They're exempt from our code, but this stuff is happening all over the county. Yeah.
If the agricultural owner reaches out to the county, that's the education piece, where the county reviewer says, if you have a bona fide agricultural use, you're exempt from the county requirements. Have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's not the county's job to say, but make sure you get your St. John's permit. But that's part of
do.
what-
I mean, we do
Yeah.
try to educate, but if the language was a little bit different, like, oh, by the way, you're exempt if you follow BMPs, which pretty much is what our silviculture regulations say. And then we direct them to the BMPs. The BMPs would direct them away from doing this type of activity. Yes, it's everything. Yes.
St. John's now requires us to get a permit determination of exemption verification before we can move forward with the project and claim that it's exempt. We pay them $50, $100, whatever it is, and submit the thing, and they say, yes, you're exempt, or no, you're not exempt. And we used to previously self-determine our exempt status. They've had problems with people determining that they're exempt when they really aren't supposed to be, and so they've had to add the verification process. I think that this is one of those cases where maybe the state of Florida needs to add the verification process as something that people find out that they should apply for when they buy ag property. But it's not necessarily something that I see as a Volusia County or an ENRAC instigated action.
Unless Volusia County said you have to show me your verification of your state permit.
And these lots are being sold. So I don't want to get into it too much. It's an active investigation. It's an active investigation. So there, I mean, you have, flood in or fill in the floodways, flood prone areas. And then, these lots are being sold off. So this is a good example of why we're talking about doing this.
Yes, so that's floodways.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a silly question, but
Approximately.
is why isn't there more, or could we facilitate more harmonization between the state rules and our rules? In other words, why can't we just bring some of the county standards up to what the state is doing and make it to where these two things are matched at least a little better versus being so different?
Well, we're preempted on agricultural use property, but when this sells, when they divide this off and they sell individual pieces, it's going to lose an agricultural exemption. So it becomes an issue if we have this language in there. We're going to catch it at the next level.
To your larger point,
Yeah.
Certainly in areas where the state standard is more strict, there's nothing that would keep the county from adopting those standards. But the staff doesn't think we should adopt the standards that the state has that are less strict. Certainly.
Well, I think the ones that are more strict, I'm just thinking of upgrading our standards when the state has got a higher bar. But I know to me, that would be a proposal that's kind of sweeping. We could deal with it in one shot versus, and maybe get away from some of this conflict. I don't know. You're right, though. It is bigger picture than this specific situation.
Alex, then Bill.
So with the wetland delineation, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong here, the state primarily looks at vegetation. That's the, let's say, kind of first start point. And then if the vegetation's not there, they dive into the more nitty-gritty sciences. If removing vegetation on agricultural lands is exempted because it's ag, we are shooting ourselves in the foot for delineating every single agricultural property that gets cleared. I'm just gonna say that.
They go test for their soils, and if they find that your soils moved, they assume the whole damn area that you touched was wetland.
You can remove vegetation, but if you're not changing the topography, you're still going to have that flooding, and it's still going to keep creating the hydric soil. So you really have to dredge or fill to change a pasture or a wetland, and that's not allowed by either state or the county, right?
It's the one by that.
So with that being said, the big EPA section where they came in with the fine for what's being built out as Avalon and Margaritaville, that was being cleared under the guise of hay production. but they were kind of fined because of that. With that being said, I guess the comment there is you can change a wetland without grading or filling.
Like a forested wetland to a pasture. But
That's
the
degrading
pasture-
in quality and function.
It is. And then the pasture would still have the wetland vegetation. Like you can try to plant some bahia grass in a wetland that you've taken the pine trees out of it. Say it was a wet prairie or something, or a wet pine forest. You can take all that vegetation out and plant bahia grass, but it's not really going to grow because it still has the water on it. Bahia grass isn't tolerant to that flooding. So yeah, you can degrade the function. You sure can. And back to Margaritaville, they brought in that limestone. And so they did get an enforcement case, EPA, and they had to do a bunch of restoration. And I don't know what, but maybe $7 million of a fine. So that was not, they did not totally get away with that.
We have, Alex, did you finish? And okay, I think it was Jessica and then, Jack is done. Okay, Jessica.
On the suggestion on the overall sheet on removing the exemption for deferring to state permitting for municipalities on minimum standards, what I have heard from municipalities is that they don't necessarily have staff that are qualified to do review. And so is there a level of, for the actual wetlands you defer to permit, but they enforce the buffers? Is that the carve out we're looking for, or what?
Well, so the way that it's written is that a property that has a valid ERP permit is exempt for a city. What happens in reality is that some cities say, we just defer to the state for all permitting requirements. Well, what that means is all of the things that are exempt from the state, like docks and seawalls and whatever, don't get any permits. They don't get a local permit, they don't get a state permit because they're exempt.
I see.
So the exemption itself isn't actually bad, right? But the way that that's being interpreted by the cities is where we kind of go sideways, right? If it really were only those projects that have a valid ERP permit, you might lose some mitigation. You're certainly losing avoidance and minimization. But at least, somebody's reviewing that impact. The cities then should be looking at the things that are exempt from state permits and the buffer.
I see. So it might be clarification language that they have to produce a valid ERP permit, and it cannot be a general exemption, and kind of specifying that and it's an enforcement thing too, like we've talked about. So, okay, that makes sense.
It is 3:37. Do we have more? We have a few more minutes to go, 20 minutes to go to our meeting. Is it going to be August 2nd? Is it August 2nd, the next meeting? And that's the day after a nighttime council meeting? It's a daytime. Okay, good. Okay. Thank you.
Andy suggested that I summarize what I already know. So to summarize what we've talked about that you would like to see is for staff to define how we are currently implementing avoidance and minimization. Identify some examples of specific areas where we're talking about language to be consistent with the comp plan. Come back with some suggested buffer widths. I would say maybe for that we could also provide some of the buffer research that's out there.
Yes.
There's some, not a lot. And then I wrote down, but I'm not clear about potential standards for what we were talking about, making the buffer requirements more clear for like accessory structures. That one isn't as clear in my mind as all the others.
Or mine. Can someone clarify that?
Yeah, I think I
Request.
added that one. I think, the last bullet, strengthen regulations for disturbance to buffers. So I think the request is, what language would staff suggest to strengthen those regulations? And we talked about, for accessory
Mhm.
structures. So maybe that's a specific item that.
Yeah,
could
the
come.
original question Jessica asked was what was the problem
Right.
that it was trying to solve? So maybe showing what would be ideal.
And then if that's the last one, Tyler, do you want to motion our slate of items?
He smirks. Define how we currently implement avoidance and minimization.
So I don't know that my prior motion had a second or where we left off, but whether it's amend, reissue, whatever, I motion that the list as just read by Ginger and modified through our conversation, primarily of defining the current implementation and what the proposed changes that we discussed are, be put together by staff so that we can discuss it at our next meeting.
All those in, any discussion? All of those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. I have one last item though, maybe just to put this out to the group and see if it helps. We talked at the beginning of the meeting about the difference between minutes, 13 pages of verbatim or attempts at verbatim, what we talked about, and more something that kind of focuses on discussions and action items. It seems that it's difficult because of the way we're doing minutes, almost in a verbatim way, that it takes a long time to produce them. And most of us, I see us taking notes in these meetings, but to me, it would be helpful, and I think could be helpful for the group to fairly shortly after the meeting, just have a very brief summary of what the next steps that we agreed to are, because if there's something that individually we would like to go read more about, it's just a thought. I don't know if that would be helpful. I know what I wrote down. I hope it's the same thing you wrote down, but I'm not sure.
I can follow up with an email after the meeting.
I mean,
That's
just a little couple bullet points, and then that might be helpful to help us stay on track.
And then if I have it wrong or whatever, you can write back and say, well, that's not what I thought. So
Thank you, Ginger.
I think in general, there's a lot more information in the minutes than what we need to necessarily have. If I were a third-party observer, if I was coming from the public, I would be looking into the tapes or listening to the tapes if there was something specific I wanted. I think for Chelsea and Brianna's sake, that we probably don't need that level of detail in the minutes, and we might be able to get them sooner as well, which would, I think that is a beneficial direction.
I think it might help to focus on when we discuss something, to focus on these were the points in favor, these were the points not, against. Here's what we agreed we'd do next. And that should make life somewhat easier. Wendy.
How long are the audio recordings preserved?
I don't know the answer.
7 years, something like that.
Okay. All right.
There's no closed captioning of these meetings performed, correct?
Correct.
Okay, because lots of times for council meetings, because it takes so long to get the minutes, I go to the closed captioning and I do word searches for what I'm interested in.
Not an easy thing.
I don't think for here. Yeah.
No.
Right now, there's very few of our meetings closed captioned in that manner.
Okay.
Do we need the detailed minutes then somewhere for ADA purposes or no?
No.
Great.
Anything else that the group would like to bring up? Then do I need to make a motion, ask for a motion to adjourn? All right.
Well, let's just talk about, so our next meeting is August 2nd. August 2nd, right? Same time, same place. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure we're all on, we got a little squirrely there. Yeah, on dates. So we're back on our normal pattern. Okay. And we'll come with this and the only thing on the agenda will be wetlands and whatever else you want to discuss after that. Yes, and I'll send an email and let everyone know if we get an actual council date and what a link. Well, I'll send you when I know the date. The agenda will be published later, and I can give you a link to that when it's out there.
Great. Alrighty then. Thank you very much, and we're adjourned 16 minutes early.